The deaf bride arrived to laughter. Until the rancher said she was better than every one of you, the wagon rolled to a stop in front of the ranch house, and every hand on the property stopped working to watch. Jake Martinez had been the talk of 3 counties for weeks now, ever since word spread that he'd sent for a mail-order bride. The men gathered near the bunkhouse, elbows nudging ribs, grins spreading across sunburned faces. When the woman stepped down from the wagon, she moved with careful precision, her hands trailing along the wooden side for balance. Her dress was plain but clean, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. She stood there in the dust, turning her head slightly as if listening to something none of them could hear. Pete Cooper, the loudest mouth on the ranch, let out a snort of laughter. Several others joined in, the sound rippling through the group like wind through dry grass. The woman's face remained calm, unchanged, as if the laughter didn't exist at all. Jake stepped forward from the porch, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. He walked straight to her, his jaw set tight, his eyes scanning the faces of his workers with the kind of look that could freeze a running horse. He took her hand gently, and she smiled, her fingers curving around his. Then Jake turned to face the men. The laughter died in their throats. His voice came out low and hard, carrying across the yard like the crack of a whip. "She's deaf," he said. "She can't hear a word any of you are saying, but I'll tell you something right now. She's got more courage in her little finger than the whole lot of you combined. She traveled 1,500 miles alone to marry a man she'd never met, to build a life in a place she'd never seen. How many of you would have the guts to do that?" The silence that followed was absolute. Pete looked down at his boots. Others shifted their weight, suddenly finding the ground very interesting. Jake continued, his hand still holding hers. "Her name is Lucy Brennan, and she's going to be my wife. She's going to be the lady of this ranch. And if any man here has a problem with that, you can collect your pay and be off this property by sundown." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Jake turned back to Lucy, guiding her toward the house. She walked beside him with her head high, her step sure and steady. At the door, he paused and signed something to her with his hands, slow and deliberate. She looked up at him, her eyes bright, and signed something back. The men watched them disappear inside. Then, one by one, they returned to their work, the easy laughter of moments before replaced by something quieter, something that felt uncomfortably close to shame. Pete Cooper stood alone by the corral fence staring at the house. He'd laughed the loudest, and now that laugh sat in his gut like a stone. He'd spent 5 years working this ranch, thought he knew the boss well enough. But he'd never seen that look in Jake's eyes before, that fierce protection, that absolute certainty. Inside the house, Jake led Lucy through rooms she'd only seen in the photographs he'd sent. The kitchen with its iron stove, the parlor with windows facing west, the bedroom upstairs where evening light painted the walls gold. She touched everything lightly, learning the space through her fingers, mapping her new world. Jake watched her, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. He'd been honest in his letters about the hardness of ranch life, about the isolation in the work. She'd been honest back about her deafness, about the school where she'd learned to read and write, about the fire that had taken her hearing when she was 6 years old. They'd written to each other for 8 months before he'd sent the money for her passage. Now she was here, real and solid and braver than he'd imagined. She turned to him and signed a question. He was still learning, still slow, but he understood. She was asking if she'd caused trouble. If those men outside were angry. Jake shook his head. He signed back carefully. "You caused nothing. They were fools. It's done now." Lucy smiled, but her eyes held doubt. She'd seen reactions like that before, knew what people thought when they realized she couldn't hear. Jake could see it in her face, that old familiar hurt dressed up as acceptance. It made his anger burn hotter, made him wish he'd done more than just words to set those men straight. But Lucy touched his arm, drew his attention back to her. She signed something longer, her hands moving with practiced grace. Jake caught most of it. She was saying that words were enough, that she didn't need him to fight, that she just needed him to stand beside her, the way he already had. Outside, the sun was dropping toward the mountains. The ranch was returning to its evening rhythms, cattle calling, horses nickering in the corrals. But something had shifted. Some unspoken rule had been laid down, and every man on the property knew it, whether they wanted to or not. The first test came 3 days later. Lucy had taken to the ranch work with a determination that surprised everyone except Jake. She couldn't hear the chickens squawking or the hogs grunting, but she learned their patterns through sight and touch. She couldn't hear the windmill creaking, but she felt the vibrations in the pump handle and knew when the water was flowing right. She was in the garden behind the house when Pete Cooper's horse threw a shoe. He led the limping animal past the fence line, heading for the barn. Lucy was bent over tomato plants, her hands working the soil, completely unaware of his presence. Pete stopped, watching her work. The sun was high and hot, and she'd rolled her sleeves up past her elbows, tied a kerchief over her hair. Her movements were efficient, purposeful. There was nothing helpless about her. Pete felt that stone in his gut shift again. He'd been raised to tip his hat to ladies, to offer help when it was needed. But he'd laughed at this one, mocked her before he'd even known her name. The shame of it had been eating at him for 3 days straight. He cleared his throat, then remembered she couldn't hear him anyway. He stood there like an idiot, holding his horse's reins, trying to figure out how to apologize to someone who couldn't hear apologies. Finally, he walked to where she could see him, moving slow so he wouldn't startle her. Lucy looked up, her hands stilling in the dirt. Her expression was cautious but not afraid. Pete pulled off his hat, held it against his chest. He didn't know any sign language, had no way to tell her what he needed to say. So he did the only thing he could think of. He pointed to himself, then made a gesture he hoped she'd understand, tapping his temple and shaking his head. Stupid. He was stupid. Then he touched his heart and bowed his head slightly. Lucy studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, wasn't forgiveness wrapped up in a bow, but it was acknowledgement. She'd seen his gesture, understood what he was trying to say. She nodded once, then went back to her tomatoes. Pete put his hat back on and led his horse away, feeling like maybe that stone had gotten a little bit lighter. It wasn't much, but it was something. A start, at least, toward being the kind of man who deserved to work for a boss like Jake Martinez on a ranch that now had a lady like Lucy Brennan running its household. That night, Jake taught Lucy 3 new signs at the dinner table. The first was for Pete Cooper's name. The second was for apology. The third was for acceptance. Lucy's hands formed the shapes carefully, committing them to memory. Then she signed something that made Jake laugh out loud, a rare sound that filled the room with warmth. She wanted to know the sign for stubborn cowboy. Jake showed her, grinning, and she laughed too, silent but absolutely real, her shoulders shaking with it. Outside, the night was settling in cool and clear. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called. Lucy couldn't hear it, but she felt Jake tense beside her, saw his head turn toward the sound. She touched his arm, asked with her eyes what it was. He showed her with his hands, making the sign for coyote, then for far away, then for safe. She relaxed, trusting his reading of the world around them, the world she experienced so differently but was learning to navigate with him beside her. The ranch hands bedded down in the bunkhouse, their conversations quieter than usual. Pete lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling beams. Tomorrow he'd ask Jake to teach him some signs. Just a few. Just enough to be decent. Several bunks over, another hand named Charlie Dawson was thinking the same thing. The idea spread through the room like slow-burning fire, unspoken but understood. If Lucy Brennan was going to be part of this ranch, then they needed to be part of her world too. It was only right. It was only fair. And maybe, just maybe, it was the least they could do after the welcome they'd given her. Jake held Lucy's hand as they climbed the stairs to bed. 3 days married, and already he couldn't imagine this house without her in it. She'd brought something here that had been missing, something he hadn't even known was absent until she arrived. Not just her presence, but her strength, her refusal to be diminished by the world's expectations or limitations. She was teaching him something about courage, about the difference between hearing and listening, about the many ways people could communicate if they just tried hard enough. He squeezed her hand gently, and she squeezed back, their own private language already forming in the spaces between words. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning when 3 strangers rode onto the property. They came in fast, their horses lathered with sweat, their faces hard with purpose. Jake was out checking fence lines in the north pasture. Lucy was alone in the house, kneading bread dough in the kitchen, flour dusting her arms up to the elbows. She didn't hear the horses, didn't hear the boots on the porch or the door being kicked open. The first sign of anything wrong was the shadow that fell across her workspace, blocking the morning light. Lucy turned, her hands still white with flour, and found herself facing a man with a gun pointed at her chest. His mouth was moving, words she couldn't hear spilling out in what looked like angry bursts. 2 more men crowded in behind him, their eyes scanning the room with the quick efficiency of people who'd done this before. The first man stepped closer, his gun steady, his face twisted with frustration when she didn't respond to whatever he was saying. Lucy's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind went cold and clear. She had learned long ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She needed to think, needed to understand what they wanted. She pointed to her ears and shook her head, the universal gesture she'd used 1,000 times before. "I can't hear you." The man's face changed, confusion replacing anger for just a moment. Then he grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. He dragged her toward the door, and she understood then what they wanted. A hostage. Insurance. They were outlaws, most likely, running from something or towards something, and she was just convenient leverage. Lucy let herself be pulled along, her mind racing through possibilities. Jake was gone. The ranch hands were scattered across the property doing their morning work. Nobody knew these men were here. Nobody was coming to help. She was on her own, deaf and defenseless in the eyes of these criminals, but they didn't know what she knew. They didn't know that being deaf had taught her to see everything, to read faces and body language like other people read books. They didn't know that silence was her natural state, that she could move through it like a ghost when she needed to. They didn't know that Jake had been teaching her to shoot, that she knew where he kept the rifle above the mantel and the pistol in the desk drawer. Most importantly, they didn't know that she wasn't the helpless victim they assumed she was. The lead outlaw, a man with a scar running down his left cheek, shoved Lucy toward a chair in the parlor. He was still talking, his mouth moving in what she guessed were threats or demands. The other two men were ransacking the house, pulling open drawers, dumping out boxes, looking for money or valuables. Lucy sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes tracking every movement. She was counting. 3 men, 2 guns that she could see. The third man had a knife on his belt. The windows were open, curtains moving slightly in the morning breeze. The front door was still ajar from when they'd kicked it in. Scarface grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His mouth moved again, slower this time, exaggerated. He was trying to make her understand something. Lucy watched his lips, pieced together words from the shapes. Wait, boss, husband. Her blood ran cold. They were going to wait for Jake to come back. They were going to use her to trap him, to get whatever they wanted from him, and then probably kill them both. She couldn't let that happen. She needed to act now, while they were distracted, while they still thought she was just a scared woman waiting to be rescued. Lucy took a slow breath, centering herself the way Jake had taught her at target practice. She needed to be smart about this. 3 against 1 were bad odds, but she had advantages they didn't know about. She understood silence in a way they never could. She could read their intentions in their faces and the way they moved. And most importantly, they were underestimating her. That was the biggest advantage of all. One of the other men called out something from the kitchen. Scarface turned his head to respond, his attention diverted for just a second. Lucy moved. She lunged sideways out of the chair, hitting the floor and rolling toward the desk. Scarface shouted something, swinging his gun toward her, but she was already behind the desk, her hand closing around the drawer handle. She yanked it open, grabbed the pistol Jake kept loaded there, and came up firing. The first shot went wide. She'd rushed it, let fear pull her aim off. But the second shot caught Scarface in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his gun with a curse Lucy couldn't hear but could see written across his face. The other 2 men came running from different parts of the house. Lucy fired again, forcing them to dive for cover. She was behind the desk, a heavy oak piece that Jake's grandfather had built, thick enough to stop bullets. For now, she had the advantage of position. But she only had so many bullets, and they'd recover from their surprise soon enough. She needed to change the situation, needed to do more than just hold them off. Lucy's eyes went to the window, to the yard beyond where she could see the bunkhouse in the distance. If she could just signal someone, get help coming, she might survive this. But the men were between her and the window, and they were getting organized now, spreading out, trying to flank her position. The third man, the one with the knife, was circling around through the dining room. Lucy could see him in the mirror that hung on the far wall, could track his progress by his reflection. She counted his steps, timed his movement, then fired through the wall where she calculated he'd be. The mirror shattered, and she saw him drop, clutching his leg. 2 wounded, 1 still fighting fit. Better odds, but still not good enough. Scarface had retrieved his gun with his good hand. Blood was soaking through his shirt, but he was still dangerous, still determined. He and the second man were coordinating now, using hand signals that Lucy could see clearly from her position. They were going to rush her from 2 sides at once, overwhelm her before she could reload. She had maybe 3 bullets left. Not enough. She needed something else, some other weapon or advantage. The bread dough? She'd left it on the kitchen table, and there was flour everywhere from her baking. Lucy's mind raced through the possibilities, through everything Jake had taught her about the ranch, about survival, about fighting. Flour dust in the air could explode if it met fire. There were matches in the kitchen drawer. The stove was still hot from her breakfast cooking. It was insane, dangerous, could burn the whole house down. But it was a chance, maybe her only chance. Lucy made her decision. She fired her remaining bullets in rapid succession, not aiming to hit, but to make them keep their heads down. Then she ran for the kitchen, her feet silent on the wooden floor, her eyes on the sack of flour by the stove. Behind her, she could sense, rather than hear, the men giving chase. She grabbed the flour sack, ripped it open, and flung it into the air with all her strength. White powder exploded through the kitchen, coating everything, hanging suspended in the morning light. Then Lucy grabbed the lantern from the table, the one that was still burning low from when she'd lit it before dawn. She hurled it into the cloud of flour dust and threw herself behind the heavy kitchen table, curling into a ball with her arms over her head. She couldn't hear the explosion, but she felt it, a wave of heat and pressure that rattled the windows and knocked pots off their hooks. The kitchen filled with fire and smoke, flames racing across the flour-coated surfaces in a hungry rush. Lucy crawled toward the back door, staying low where the air was clearer. Her dress was smoking, singed by the flash fire, but she was alive and moving. She burst out into the yard, gasping for clean air, and that's when she saw Pete Cooper running toward the house. He must have seen the smoke, must have realized something was wrong. Behind him, other ranch hands were coming at a dead run, drawn by the column of black smoke rising from the kitchen. Lucy pointed frantically at the front of the house, trying to communicate the danger. Pete seemed to understand. He ran past her, around to the front porch, his gun drawn. The other hands followed, surrounding the house, cutting off the outlaws' escape routes. Lucy sank down onto the grass, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger was past, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. The fire in the kitchen was spreading, but Pete and the others were already working to contain it, hauling water from the pump, beating at flames with wet blankets. Two of the outlaws stumbled out the front door, choking on smoke, their hands raised in surrender. The third one, Scarface, tried to make a run for it out the back, but ran straight into Charlie Dawson, who laid him out with a single punch that dropped him like a stone. The ranch hands tied all three men up, their wounds roughly bandaged, their weapons confiscated. They'd live to stand trial, which was more mercy than they deserved. Jake rode in 20 minutes later, his horse at a full gallop, having seen the smoke from miles away. He hit the ground running, his eyes wild with fear, searching for Lucy. When he found her sitting on the grass, wrapped in a blanket someone had brought, soot-stained and singed but alive, he fell to his knees beside her. His hands moved in frantic signs, asking if she was hurt, if she was okay, what had happened. Lucy signed back slowly, her hands still shaking, telling him everything. The outlaws, the gun, the flour explosion, the fire. Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair. She felt him shaking too, felt the fear he'd been carrying drain out of him now that he knew she was safe. Around them, the ranch hands were still fighting the fire, but they'd gotten it contained to just the kitchen. The house would need repairs, but it would survive, just like Lucy had survived. That evening, after the sheriff had come and gone with the prisoners, after the fire was fully out and the damage assessed, Jake sat with Lucy on the porch steps. The sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and red, and the whole ranch seemed to be holding its breath, processing what had happened. Jake's hands moved in slow, deliberate signs. He was telling her that she'd been incredible, that she'd saved herself and probably saved him too, that he'd never been more proud or more terrified in his entire life. Lucy signed back with a small smile. She told him that being deaf hadn't made her weak. It had made her observant. It had taught her to see things others missed, to think instead of just reacting, to find strengths in places others saw only limitations. She'd survived because she trusted herself, because she'd refused to be the helpless victim everyone expected her to be. Jake nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears, his hands forming the sign for strong, then for brave, then for mine. She was his wife, his partner, and after today, anyone who doubted her place on this ranch would have to answer to every man who'd seen what she'd done. Pete Cooper walked over, his hat in his hands, his face smudged with soot. He stood there awkwardly for a moment, then, slowly, carefully, made a sign. It was rough, unpracticed, but Lucy recognized it. Thank you. He was thanking her for fighting, for not giving up, for giving them time to help. Lucy's eyes went wide with surprise, then she smiled and signed back. You're welcome. Pete grinned, looking pleased with himself, and Jake realized that his ranch hands had been learning signs, had been practicing in secret, trying to find ways to communicate with Lucy. Charlie Dawson came next, then others, each of them making simple signs. Hello. Good job. Safe now. They were trying, stumbling through this new language, but they were trying, and that meant everything. Lucy looked at Jake with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by the acceptance she'd never expected to find, by the community that was forming around her despite all the barriers that should have kept her isolated. Jake squeezed her hand, signed one more thing. Home. This was her home now, he told her. Not just the ranch, not just the house, but this place with these people who were learning to see her the way he did. As someone strong, capable, and worthy of respect, the deaf bride who'd arrived to Laughter had become the woman who'd saved the ranch, who'd fought off outlaws with nothing but her wits and courage, who'd proven that hearing had nothing to do with strength. The kitchen would need to be rebuilt. Jake hired carpenters from town, and the work began the following week. Lucy insisted on being involved in the planning, on choosing how the new space would be laid out. She wanted better light, she signed to Jake. She wanted to be able to see anyone approaching while she worked. She wanted windows facing the yard so she could keep track of the ranch's rhythms, even though she couldn't hear them. Jake made sure she got everything she asked for. While the carpenters worked, Lucy took over cooking duties in a temporary outdoor setup. The ranch hands ate meals under the stars, gathered around a long table Pete and Charlie had built from spare lumber. It was crude, but functional, and something unexpected happened during those weeks. The men started learning more signs. They'd ask Lucy to teach them words during meals, practicing the hand shapes while they ate. She taught them signs for the foods they were eating, for the weather, for the horses and cattle. Simple things at first, but the vocabulary grew day by day. More importantly, they started understanding the world the way Lucy experienced it. Without the constant background noise they were used to, they noticed things they'd never paid attention to before. The way shadows moved across the land as the sun traveled. The patterns of dust that showed where animals had passed. The vibrations in the ground when horses approached. Lucy lived in a world of visual information, and as the men learned to communicate with her, they began to see that world too. One afternoon, a neighboring rancher named Henry Blake rode over to see the repairs. He was an older man, set in his ways, and he'd heard the stories about Jake's deaf wife and the outlaw attack. He'd come partly out of curiosity, partly to see if Jake needed help, but mostly to judge for himself whether the gossip was true. Henry dismounted near the construction site, his eyes scanning the scene with the critical gaze of someone who'd been ranching for 40 years. Lucy was directing the carpenters through a series of gestures, showing them exactly how she wanted a cabinet positioned. She couldn't hear their questions, but she watched their faces, read their confusion, and adjusted her instructions until they understood. Henry watched this interaction with growing fascination. The woman moved with absolute confidence, her silent communication somehow more effective than all the shouting he usually heard on job sites. Jake came out to greet Henry, and the two men shook hands. Henry jerked his chin toward Lucy. "That's her, then," he said, "the one everyone's talking about." Jake's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his voice level. "That's my wife, Lucy." Henry nodded slowly, still watching her work. "Heard she took down 3 armed men with nothing but a kitchen gun and some baking flour. That true?" Jake smiled, couldn't help it. "That's true." "Every word of it." Henry let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." He paused, then added, "Also heard she can't hear nothing." Jake's smile faded. "She's deaf, yes, but that doesn't make her less than anyone else. In fact, I'd say it makes her more observant than most people I know." Henry held up a hand. "Didn't mean no offense. Just trying to understand how she managed what she did is all. Most folks would have panicked." Jake's expression softened a bit. "Lucy doesn't panic. She thinks. She sees things others miss because she has to rely on her eyes instead of her ears. Those outlaws underestimated her, thought she'd be easy to control. They learned different." Henry nodded again, his respect evident in his weathered face. "I reckon they did. Mind if I meet her proper like? I'd like to pay my respects to a lady that brave." Jake called Lucy over and introduced her to Henry. The older rancher removed his hat and bowed slightly, a gesture of respect from his generation. Then he did something that surprised Jake. He pointed to himself and said his name slowly, exaggerating his mouth movements so Lucy could read his lips. Then he placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head, the same gesture Pete had made weeks earlier. An apology for any disrespect, an acknowledgement of her courage. Lucy smiled and signed a response. Jake translated. "She says thank you, and she's pleased to meet you." Henry watched her hands move with obvious interest. "That's remarkable," he said quietly. "Whole conversation happening right in front of me, and I can't understand a word. Makes a man realize how much he takes for granted." Jake nodded. "It does," he agreed. "Every single day, it does." Henry stayed for supper that night, eating at the outdoor table with the ranch hands. He watched the easy communication flowing between Lucy and the men, the signs they were learning, the way they'd adapted their whole routine to include her. He saw Pete ask Lucy a question in halting sign language, saw her respond with patient corrections, saw the pride on Pete's face when he got it right. This wasn't what Henry had expected to find. He'd expected to see a woman isolated by her disability, struggling to fit into a world that couldn't accommodate her. Instead, he saw a woman who'd forced the world to accommodate her, who'd taught these rough cowboys a new language, who'd carved out a place for herself through sheer determination and courage. Before Henry left, he pulled Jake aside. "You got yourself a hell of a wife there," he said. Jake nodded, his eyes on Lucy as she laughed at something Charlie was signing. "I know," Jake replied. "Best decision I ever made was sending for her." Henry clapped him on the shoulder. "Word of advice, from one rancher to another. Don't ever let her think you're protecting her because she's deaf. Protect her because she's your wife, your partner. She's already proven she can protect herself." Jake smiled. "I learned that lesson the hard way," he said. Henry laughed. "I bet you did." As Henry rode away, Jake realized something had shifted again. The story of Lucy's bravery was spreading beyond the ranch, reaching other communities, changing minds. People who might have dismissed her because of her deafness were being forced to reconsider their assumptions. Lucy wasn't becoming famous because she was deaf and had overcome it. She was becoming respected because she was capable, brave, and refused to let anything stop her from building the life she wanted. The new kitchen was finished 3 weeks later. It was beautiful, with windows on 3 sides and a layout designed specifically for Lucy's needs. She stood in the center of it, turning slowly, taking it all in. Jake watched her face, saw the moment she realized this space was truly hers, built to her specifications, honoring her way of experiencing the world. She turned to him with tears in her eyes and signed a simple message. Perfect. It's perfect. That night they held a celebration. Lucy cooked a feast in her new kitchen, and every ranch hand on the property crowded into the house to eat. They'd all contributed something, whether it was helping with construction, learning sign language, or simply treating Lucy with the respect she deserved. Now they were a family of sorts, bound together by shared experience and mutual respect. Pete stood and raised his glass, making a toast in sign language that he'd been practicing for days. "To Lucy," he signed, his movements slow but sincere. "The bravest woman in 3 counties, a lady of this ranch, and the best teacher a bunch of stubborn cowboys could ask for." Everyone cheered, and Lucy blushed but smiled, her hands moving in a response that Jake translated. "She says you're not stubborn, just slow learners." The room erupted in laughter, and Pete grinned. "Fair enough," he signed back, getting the movements mostly right. "Fair enough." As the party wound down and the men filtered back to the bunkhouse, Jake and Lucy stood together on their porch, looking out over the ranch. The moon was high and bright, painting everything in silver light. Jake signed a question he'd been wanting to ask for weeks. "Are you happy here? Despite everything that's happened, despite the danger and the hard work and the isolation, are you happy?" Lucy thought for a moment, her hands still. Then she signed her response with absolute certainty. "Yes." "I'm happier here than I ever thought I could be. This place, these people, this is where I belong. Not in spite of being deaf, but as myself, complete and whole. You've given me that." "They've given me that." She paused, then added, "And I've given them something too, I think. A different way of seeing the world. A different kind of strength." Jake pulled her close, his heart full to bursting. "That you have," he signed against her shoulder. "That you have indeed." They stood there in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd found each other across distance and difference, who'd built something real and lasting in a harsh land that didn't forgive weakness. Lucy couldn't hear the night sounds around them, the cattle lowing in the distance or the wind rustling through the grass. But she felt the vibration of Jake's heartbeat against her cheek, felt the solid presence of the home they were building together, and that was all the sound she needed. 6 months later, Lucy discovered she was pregnant. She told Jake first, signing the news with hands that trembled slightly with joy and fear. Jake's face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds. Surprise, delight, concern, pride. He signed back a flurry of questions. Was she sure? How was she feeling? Did she need anything? Should they send for a doctor? Lucy laughed and signed for him to slow down, to breathe, to stop worrying. She was healthy and strong, and women had been having babies since the dawn of time. They'd figure this out together, the same way they'd figured out everything else. The ranch hands were thrilled when they found out. Pete started building a cradle in his spare time, working on it in the evenings by lamplight. Charlie began knitting baby blankets, a skill his mother had taught him that he'd never admitted to before. The others contributed in their own ways, their excitement over the coming baby a testament to how much they'd come to care about Lucy and Jake. But the pregnancy brought new challenges. Lucy couldn't hear her own body the way other women couldn't hear the baby's heartbeat through the doctor's stethoscope or hear the reassurances spoken at checkups. She had to rely entirely on what she could feel, on the movements inside her, on the doctor's written notes and Jake's translations. It was frightening at times not being able to access that particular kind of information, but Jake was there for every appointment, learning medical signs, making sure Lucy understood everything the doctor said. As her belly grew, Lucy had to adjust how she worked around the ranch. She couldn't move as quickly, couldn't bend as easily, had to be more careful about everything. It frustrated her at first, this physical limitation on top of her deafness. She'd proven herself capable and strong, and now she felt awkward and slow. But the ranch hands stepped in without being asked, taking over the heavier chores, making sure she didn't overexert herself. It wasn't pity, Lucy realized. It was family taking care of family. One evening in her 7th month, Lucy felt the baby kick hard enough that Jake could feel it through her belly. His face lit up with wonder, and he signed. "He's strong, this little one." Or she, Lucy signed back with a smile. "We don't know yet." Jake grinned. "Either way, they'll be strong like their mother." Lucy shook her head. "Strong like their father, too. Like their whole family here on this ranch." The baby came on a cold March morning. Lucy's labor started before dawn, and Jake sent Charlie riding hard for the doctor while he stayed with Lucy, holding her hand, signing encouragement and love. The doctor arrived 2 hours later. In between contractions, Lucy followed his instructions as Jake translated them. It was a long, hard labor, made more difficult by Lucy's inability to hear the doctor's guidance in the moment. But she pushed through, drawing on reserves of strength she'd developed over a lifetime of overcoming obstacles. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, the doctor laid the infant on Lucy's chest. "It's a girl," Jake signed, tears streaming down his face. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Lucy held her daughter close, feeling the vibrations of the baby's cries against her skin, even though she couldn't hear them. The baby quieted almost immediately at her mother's touch, and Lucy looked down at the tiny face with overwhelming love. They named her Rose, after Jake's mother. As Lucy recovered from the birth, the whole ranch seemed to transform around the new baby. The cowboys took turns visiting, each one making awkward cooing noises they knew Lucy couldn't hear, but making them anyway. They brought gifts, simple things they'd made or bought in town. Pete presented his cradle, beautifully carved with horses and cattle running along the sides. Charlie brought a stack of soft blankets in every color he could knit. Others brought toys, clothes, books for when Rose was older. But the most remarkable thing happened when Rose was 3 weeks old. Lucy was feeding her in the rocking chair by the window when she noticed something. The baby was watching her face with intense concentration, tracking her mother's expressions with dark eyes that seemed to see everything. And when Lucy signed to Jake across the room, Rose's eyes followed the movement of her mother's hands. She was already learning, already beginning to understand that communication happened through sight and touch in her world. Jake noticed it too. "She's going to learn sign language before she learns to talk," he signed to Lucy with wonder. Lucy nodded, her heart full. "She'll grow up bilingual," Lucy signed back. "She'll be able to communicate in both our worlds. What a gift that will be." Jake sat down beside them, his finger gently touching Rose's tiny hand. "She'll bridge the gap," he signed. "She'll be able to hear, but she'll understand silence too. She'll have the best of both worlds." As Rose grew, that prediction proved true. By 6 months, she was responding to signs as readily as to spoken words. By a year, she was using simple signs herself, communicating her needs to Lucy directly without requiring Jake to translate. The ranch hands learned even more sign language, wanting to be able to talk to Rose in her mother's language. The little girl became a translator herself, a bridge between the hearing world and the deaf world, moving between both with effortless ease. On Rose's 2nd birthday, the ranch threw a party that brought neighbors from miles around. Henry Blake came, along with families from other ranches, townspeople, even the sheriff who'd arrested the outlaws years before. They all came to celebrate the little girl, but also to see the remarkable community that had formed around Lucy and Jake Martinez. Word had spread about the ranch where cowboys learned sign language, where a deaf woman had become not just accepted, but respected and loved, where differences were seen as strengths rather than weaknesses. Lucy stood on the porch watching Rose play with other children in the yard and felt Jake's arm around her waist. "This is what I dreamed of," she signed to him. "Not just a home or a husband, but a place where I belong completely, where being deaf doesn't make me less, where I can be a mother and a wife and a partner without constantly fighting to prove myself. You gave me that. This ranch gave me that." Jake signed back, his movements tender and sure. "You gave us something too. You taught us to see differently, to communicate in new ways, to understand that there are many kinds of strength. You made this ranch better just by being here. And Rose," he added, nodding toward their daughter, "she's going to grow up knowing that differences should be celebrated, not hidden. That's your legacy." As the sun set on the party, on the ranch, on another day in the life Lucy had built for herself, she looked around at the faces of the people she'd come to love. Cowboys who'd learned to sign, neighbors who'd learned to respect, a husband who'd learned to see the world through her eyes, and a daughter who would grow up knowing that communication was about more than just words, that strength came in many forms, that being different was something to be proud of. The deaf bride who'd arrived to laughter had become the heart of a community, proof that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle, that love could transcend any barrier, and that home was wherever you found people willing to meet you in your world, whatever that world might be.